You wrote a wonderful essay called Language and Freedom. Before I get there, though, it seems to me what the motivation to study language was to understand something which you often talk about as human nature. I was going to ask you what I still don't quite know what the phrase means, human nature. But you seemed attracted to the notion that understanding human nature would help us understand social interactions, an issue that has been and clearly is very important to you. And you get there. And you were attracted and have written a lot about Rousseau. Now, I remember Jean-Jacques Rousseau had a big impact on me when I read him, The Social Contract, because of that famous phrase, man is born free but lives forever in chains, which took me a long time to understand. And but Rousseau had this idea, which in your writing you've repeated a number of times, that somehow the natural state of man, and we'll just use man for that moment here, is a good one, and somehow society screws that up. So, for example, you wrote, actually at the time of American Draft Resistors, you were saying many who were beginning to recover from the catastrophe of 20th century Western civilization, which has so tragically confirmed Rousseau's judgment. And he wrote, "Here arose the national wars, battles, murders, and reprisals which make nature tremble and shook reason, and all those horrible prejudices which rank the honor of shedding human blood among the virtues. The most decent men learned to consider it one of their duties to murder their fellow man. At length men were seen to massacre each other by the thousands without knowing why. More murders were committed on a single day of fighting, and more horrors in the capture of a single city than were committed in the state of nature during whole centuries over the entire face of the earth." Now, is that really, it seems to me that that's wrong.
That's Rousseau.
Yeah, it's Rousseau, but I mean, you quoted it. And the question is, do you agree with that? I mean, it seems to me that, in fact, one of your former colleagues, Steve Pinker, has written a book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, that in fact, if you wanted to choose a time to be around and have a happy, nonviolent life, today is a lot better than when you're being around at Neanderthal times.
Well, that's what he claims, but the weight of evidence is strongly against it.
You think so?
I think so. There's very good work by a serious anthropologist, Brian Ferguson is one, who's worked through his data and I think shown that it's probably wrong for about 95% of human existence, namely the hunter-gatherer periods. It's really with the emergence of state systems, the development of complex agriculture, they begin to get wars that are very destructive. I mean, there's killing among hunter-gatherers, but it's pretty limited.
But there has been moral progress. In fact, you wrote...
Well, one thing that he says is correct. I think that's about it. Since the Enlightenment, there has been moral progress. In our own lifetimes, there's been moral progress. So consider, for example, the status of women's rights today and in 1950. Very different. The status of civil rights, very different. Gay rights, very different. That's progress. And it's been going on slowly since the Enlightenment. But that's a pretty brief period of human history. And in fact, right at this same time have been the most murderous, destructive wars ever. And even the 70 years ago, the creation by some of the smartest people in the world of a device that may destroy us all and is on the verge of destroying us all.
We'll get to that. As you know, I'm the chairman of the board of the Atomic Scientists. It's an issue that's really of great interest to me. You actually just reproduced a quote I was going to talk about for you. Is it that there has been moral progress in many ways, status of women in particular. You talk about your daughters versus your grandmother. And you say it's fairly brief, but don't you think it's interesting that coincides with the rise of science? Do you think that's coincidental?
No, it's not coincidental. Part of the contribution of the Enlightenment was to free inquiry from constraints, which led to the rise of science. So breaking free of these fetters that society had imposed did permit the rise of science, did permit moral progress, also permitted massive destruction.
Well, now we're going to get to the massive destruction, and you're interested in that. You wrote at one point, and the transition in this language and freedom, which is really trying to understand whether your scientific and intellectual background somehow motivated, in some sense, your social activism.
Could I make...
You can say whatever you want.
Take a look at the first sentence. The first sentence of this article says, I've been asked to talk about language and freedom. There's a lot to say about language. There's a lot to say about freedom, but I have almost nothing to say about and.
Okay,
How
but here's one of the things...
How are they connected?
Here's one of the things you did say, which I find interesting, which I want to ask if it motivates you, okay? I mean, I like to believe that the intensive study of one aspect of human psychology, human language, may contribute to a humanistic social science that will serve as well as an instrument for social action.
I would like to believe that's crucial.
Yes,
I would like
has that
to
been
believe
your
that.
But has that been a motivator?
Like
No. I'm not saying you say it has, but
Yeah.
in a personal sense, do you think that makes a connection in your own personal activism?
Well, if you look at, as a historical fact, no, they're separate. But there is a kind of a connection, not a logical connection, nothing you can prove, just a suggestive relation. And it shows up in Rousseau. So if you take a look at, say, the work of Rousseau that I quoted, which is the second discourse on equality, that's his most libertarian writing.
Yeah.
He begins with a pretty strictly Cartesian view of animals as being machines, just reflexive machines compelled to do what they do by internal and external circumstances, without the creative character of human thought and behavior. And he then says, again in roughly Cartesian terms, that what is unique and distinctive about humans is this internal creative capacity. That's what makes humans different from the rest of the natural world. Then comes a thesis, which is not proved, but I think is plausible, namely any social arrangements that inhibit or constrain that free creative capacity are fundamentally illegitimate unless they can justify themselves. That means any structure of authority, domination, hierarchy, whether it's in a patriarchal family or in international affairs or anything in between, should be subject to challenge. It's not self-justifying. I mean, you can see the chain of thinking. Notice it's not a proof, but beginning with the observation that specific to human nature, a term which I don't object to, we maybe could talk about that.
Yeah.
Inherent to human nature, what's special about us is this creative character, the need to inquire, to create, to act, to choose what you do, how you speak, how you interact, and so on. There's kind of a chain of thinking from that to the conclusion that which is in Rousseau, in fact, that social structures which inhibit that are illegitimate unless proved otherwise. Like sometimes you can give an argument in favor of authority. So if I'm walking down the street with, say, my 3-year-old granddaughter, and she runs into the street and I grab her arm and pull her back, I think I can give a justification for that. But the point is that the argument is that any form of authority and domination requires justification. And usually you can't justify it, in which case you have to dismantle it and replace it by something more free and just.